Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lesson. We're going to be doing some painting today, and it should be probably maybe like another 2 or 3 sessions on this. So this is going to be our initial block in. And we're going to be working on a landscape painting, and it's going to be a low-key landscape painting, which means that we're going to be using a fairly limited range of values relative to it. Typically a high-key painting will have a large range of values, so quite high contrast. If you think of like a daylight scene where it's sunny, you might have a lot of shadows, patterns on the ground, that sort of thing. Whereas we're going to be working in twilight and creating a low-key scene. So the reference I've got up is a sort of lake scene at dusk. And the only real contrast is derived from those lights that you can see in the distance. But we won't be applying those lights today. They'll be developed later when we're starting to add detail. This initial block-in is just going to be an establishment of the broad shapes and broad values and colours that we're looking for. And I'm going to limit it to just 3 colours. So this is a good way to block in. We're going to add some variations, so there are going to be some sort of subtler brown-green shifts within the general blue-black monochrome that I'm going to create as a base. But to keep it simple, I'm just starting with ivory black, ultramarine blue, and titanium white to roughly block in these values. And that's all we're going to be doing today. So I'll be running through roughly what we're doing, and you can follow this approach as you work on your own piece. But everything we're doing today is establishing for a more detailed finished piece ultimately. I'm working on a 8x10 panel, so just a little wooden panel, and I'm working with my sketching easel. So if I tilt down, you can see that's my paints laid out. So I'm only using the black, blue and white. Most of the others are dry. Then I got my little palette cups there. And I'll probably just be using the single hog bristle brush, and that's all. So you can see this is my little plein air box, so you can imagine if I was working, let's get back into the right place. You can imagine if I was working outdoors in a twilight scene, this is how I'd set up pretty much. And I'm just using a rag with my brush, so I'll just be using the single brush. I think it's a good size for blocking in at this scale, this 8x10 panel. It's kind of like a nice level of flexibility for applying the paint, so it's going to give a fairly kind of scrubby application, which will create a nice underlying texture that will work over in later weeks. So to begin with, I'm just going to mix a kind of like slightly darkish grey, kind of blue-grey as my drawing colour. And I'm going to use that to sketch out the general shape. So if we think about these shapes, we've got our dark forest in the front, in the near foreground. Then we got this sort of lake shape that comes to a point above that. Then we have this shape of the bank, the kind of near bank, which is just a step lighter than this dark foreground. Above that we then have the sort of mountain shape, which is slightly lighter again than this shape. And then behind that we have there's a little bit of a mountain, and then our sky color. And even our sky color is pretty far off white. So it's moving towards a mid-value, that sky in the distance, and this reflection. So nothing is particularly bright. We want to leave all of that stuff pretty dark, because then it'll increase the contrast once we add these little glowing lights that you can see. So we don't want anything to be too white, so that when we actually mix up those kind of vivid orangey yellow colors for those reflected lights, and we kind of put little pinpoints on the piece, they really start to glow nicely against a kind of a dark, low-key background. So let's get started. I'm going to mix up get some of my black. I'm using a medium that's sort of mixed from mostly mineral spirits and a bit of oil. So there was a lesson I did a few weeks ago about mediums and how to layer oil paintings if you're wondering how that works. So I'm not going to be too strict with my shapes. Let's say we've got our little shape that sticks up there and that drops down. Got these two little other trees, they're kind of pine trees, they're kind of pointy. That goes flat across, cuts back up, and these sort of scrape up that way. And we've got this sloping shape, something like that. So that's going to be our bottom blocked in kind of near foreground shape. So out of that we've then got our kind of moving up to just above halfway. Those reflections. Foreground. So you can see I've already blocked in all those land masses and the water. So we're not being like super fussy about our shapes. It's a landscape. It's going to be a fairly kind of soft, dark landscape anyway. And these sorts of masses, so long as they make sense in the context of the scene, they could shift around. This mountain could be taller, it could be shorter, it could be flatter, so on. So you don't have to worry too much about being super accurate when you're doing your landscapes. You want to give the impression, a good feel of the scene that you're painting, rather than kind of slavishly trying to copy all the shapes. So there I've adjusted that more because it makes the composition a bit more interesting, not because I'm too fussed about it being super accurate, as I say. So something like that. So now we've got that blocked in. I'm going to start with my darkest value, which is going to be this near foreground. So I'm going to get some black and some blue, mix them together, test out a little bit. So you see kind of nice inky black there. Mix some medium into it. I'm going to mix a little pool of it. I can't go too far wrong with these colours because I've got so few color pigments I'm actually mixing. So I'm only mixing from black, blue and white. So it's almost pure black I'm painting here, but because I've mixed a bit of blue in, it's giving it a bit more of a blueness. And it's lightening it slightly from pure black, so we'll probably go in and use some glazes of pure black a little bit later in subsequent lessons once this is dried. Obviously glazing requires dry layers to be working over. So there we go. We've got our near foreground painted in. I'll paint just a little bit more blue into it just to give it a bit more colour, which might not be super apparent to you guys. So from there I'm now going to mix a kind of next step from this dark. So I'll go back to that original colour, see how that compares. So that's probably, that's a bit too dark, so let's add a touch of white, a touch of blue. That's probably better, that seems pretty good. We might be making adjustments to this depending on how accurately I get it. Kind of blocked in originally. And there is a little bit of a kind of slightly lighter step just at the back of this hillside. And a lot of these kind of changes in value and color are caused by a thing called aerial perspective. And I think in some of the other landscape lessons we've spoken about that a little bit. But aerial perspective is basically, as things go further in the distance, they alter. They tend to get lighter and they tend to get bluer. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's a fairly kind of accurate way of thinking of it. So in this case, this is what's happening. We've got the foreground, the trees are in about as much shadow as these trees further back beyond in the other part of the lake. But because these trees are nearer us, they're darker, the higher contrast. And you can see progressively as mountainsides go back, they're getting gradually lighter. So we've got a similar value here, but more of a blue behind that hillside. So that's not too bad. This is that reflection of the mountain in that lake. It's going to smudge off a bit once we add the actual reflection in. And that blueness kind of carries a little bit into this reflection here as well. So we can use that as the beginning of our reflection in the lake. And it's not far off. Most of these values, although might be going even ever so slightly lighter. Some little shapes in here. It's kind of like a shape at the bottom of the mountain. So I can using some downward strokes to kind of give a little suggestion of those tree tops. Anything you can do to kind of give a sense of the right texture in the landscape, you should do so. But if you're using a bigger brush, there are going to be limitations, but it can be nice, it feels vivid, it's fast. You can see how quickly I've got that blocked in. And then we've got, again, it's the edge of the forest on that mountain. Just goes slightly darker. Something like that. And a little bit lighter again below that. But being low key, all of these little changes, they're pretty subtle. So the main thing you want to make sure of is that you're not overstating things, you're not overdoing contrast. That's one of the main mistakes that people make. So again, using the side of my brush to create a bit more of a tree-like texture. Trying to use it sort of fairly erratically. Something like that is pretty good. So that's most of our kind of particularly dark values blocked in. So let's move to the sky. So let's try out actually let's try this hillside in the distance, so that's a little bit dark for it. Not too bad, this one. Could maybe be a bit less black, a bit less grey, so let's just kind of mix up some. That's better. Still a bit lighter yet. That's possibly slightly overstating the lightness of that mountainside, but I'm reluctant at this stage to make it. Overstating the darkness of that mountainside, but I want to kind of keep everything fairly dark, as I say, because when we actually get to adding in those lights next week, so I'll make this just a little bit lighter. So I'm going to paint white directly in rather than mixing it on the canvas. This is another kind of useful soften that texture, so I'm using a sort of tapping approach. And there's a slightly kind of lighter center to this sky. Which we can give the impression of. Working some white paint into it. Again, this is something we can develop later, but it does add nicely to the overall effect of that. It's not too bad. So we can leave that as it is for now. So we've got water to put in now. So to mix the right value, it's going to be closer to the sky. And fairly blue. I'm trying to use my brush strokes to kind of play around with those reflections that I mentioned earlier. I kind of established a little bit of space for them with these transitional tones that I can kind of blend into, because I want them to feel softer. So there we've got everything blocked in. So it doesn't take long, especially at that scale. Just want to increase the blueness a bit, so I've mixed up some sort of pure blue and white. Similar to the sky, I'm just going to mix up some slightly lighter values and start just giving a little bit of a sense of this reflection. I can use my finger just to blur that slightly and brush over. Yeah, so that's not too bad, pretty much all we're after. So you can't work something of this nature too much beyond what we've done today, just because, you know, we've covered the surface. You don't want to fiddle with it too much. It's nicer if it's sort of got a slightly looser quality at this stage. We're going to be playing around with glazes and adding lighter sections and altering things in the next few sessions. But as a start, it's pretty good. So it's got a nice moody atmosphere. It's effectively blocked in. So yeah, it's really simple. I'm just using three colors: black, ultramarine blue, and white. Blocking things in a fairly loose, sort of fun way. Enjoying myself. So that's it for this week. You guys can have a go at it yourself. Follow along as I'm working, and have a look at what we get done next week. We're going to be adding more detail, kind of modifying things slightly, and just generally adding to the complexity of the piece. I think probably a piece like this, let's say we'd likely spend about 3 sessions on it, so you want to get it up to this sort of point, let it dry, then we're going to work over it, which is what I'm going to be doing. So yeah, see if you've got a reference. You can look online on something like Unsplash for free references, or go out and take a photo, or if you like, ideally work outdoors directly, which would be my preference. It can be a bit tricky in twilight, so you might need a light or something along those lines for your piece. But yeah, that's pretty much it. As always, you can ask questions below the video if you need to. Sign up. Follow the link through to sign up to OCAD if you want direct tutoring from me, and have a look through all the other videos. But that's it for today, and I'll see you guys soon.